to the extent designed for advanced callers who are either just beginning to... You say it's too loud? Do you control that, or you're just controlling the taping? Okay, well, I'm used to projecting, Sam. Designed for callers who are either now just starting into challenge, or who have dabbled with challenge a little, or who are interested in going into challenge and want to know how to go about it. What's our responsibilities as callers? What do I have to learn to become a challenge caller, start working a challenge? What are my responsibilities to the dancers? When I teach my first challenge class or do a challenge workshop, what should I be doing differently here that I didn't do at advanced? This kind of thing. And that's going to be the full thrust of our discussion today. With me at the table here is Dave Stevens from Northern California, San Francisco area, and Tom Mohney from Oil City, Pennsylvania, which is the western part of the state. So this is kind of a very broad-based discussion, and it can really take any focus that you all want to focus it on. Let me ask first, just for information, how many of you, are all of you now calling advanced? Everybody is calling advanced. How many of you are calling challenge? Okay, about 4 or 5. Okay. Okay, let's start off. Dave has some initial remarks he wants to make, and then from there we'll go to Tom, and then from how the discussion is going, we'll kind of throw it open to everybody. Because the session is taped, whenever you make a comment, we'd like you to make it at the mic if possible. If in the heat of the discussion it isn't able to be made at the mic, then any comments or any questions you ask, we will have to repeat on the mic before we can answer. So it will speed up things. If you have questions, if you can line up at the mic as we've done on Wednesday mornings and that kind of thing, it'll be easiest for the taping. Okay, Dave?
That's as far as it goes. Okay, I'd like to start off by saying, in my opinion, what challenge dancing is not. It's not an advanced dance with every 6th or 7th call, a C1 call thrown in. It's not a hot hash where the caller speeds up the record and expects the dancers to run through any of the calls. It's not just gimmicky choreography. It's not shortcutting movements. It's not use of the same call over and over during the same tip. It's not a dance of equivalents or zeros. It's not breaking down the floor to show the caller's expertise. Usually dancers go into challenge because they want more out of boredom of the levels below. They can be possibly bored because of lack of creativity in the callers that they dance to, or too much repetition, or lack of preparedness on behalf of the caller that they dance to regularly. Challenge dancing should be fun, just as any other level. In order to do this, the dancer needs to win. We talk about a success rate generally traditionally accepted to be about 70% of the floor dancing. The advanced list we know has approximately 71 calls on it. The C1 list has about 90. So therefore, in your preparation for your classes that you teach, there's not that much difference in the length of time it should take for you to teach a challenge class as well as an advanced class. All challenge dancers must be willing to devote more time, interest, and study to the activity. The largest mistake I see that callers make is that they try to do the level before they're prepared. They need to know all the calls by definition on the C1 list before they start. They need a knowledge of the allowable formations calls can be done from. They must be a viable sight caller, and in order to become a challenge caller, you must first become a challenge dancer. To become a challenge dancer, what does it take? Well, it's a change in attitude. You must be first willing to accept a lower success rate, a willingness to accept new calls, new positions for a call, a willingness to accept a new way of combining calls, and be able to accept the criticism of your peers who don't want to like challenge. Be able to accept what you know and what you don't know. Enjoy APD and you must have a higher interest level. That means you must spend more time dancing. You must have a willingness to study, buy dictionaries or reference books so that you've got a source to look up calls. You must be prepared to unlearn as much as you're going to learn. Generally, we're all products, when we become a dancer, of the guy who taught us how to dance, and that just may not be the way the call should be done. And you have to be willing to accept unlearn as well as learn. You should investigate the level. Attend any dance locally you can make to observe firsthand what goes on. Don't rely solely on what others say of it. Spend time in a C1 hall at a convention and observe firsthand what goes on. Check out the credentials of the caller you're listening to, because he may not always be accurate. Ask questions. Tape programs whenever possible. In order to survive challenge dancing, the dancer should develop certain skills. You've got to be a good listener, achieve good positioning, and become accomplished at the advanced level. Well, now that you become an advanced dancer, so you want to start calling C1, so what's the first thing you do? You start a C1 class. Wrong. When you do that, you really start guinea pigging the floor. You might drive out potential dancers who might otherwise make it. And after all, dancers are the prime consideration that we're talking about here at this weekend. You start by learning how to write and read cue cards. Try calling a tip whenever possible, like at a convention. Secure the tapes of reputable callers. Transcribe the tapes and work out with checkers the choreography. Learn how the calls are put together. Don't be afraid to ask questions. The legality of something you thought of or you heard done, just because it was done or even in print somewhere, doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct. Once you've done all that, then you can start thinking about teaching your first class. The first thing you need to do is to set up a teaching order. I know a lot of callers who put teaching orders out, but then they don't have enough discipline to stick to them. And then the second thing is that they don't call every call on the list at every session that they've already taught. And that's the kind of discipline you need in order to get your dancers through a program when you do teach a class. Some callers I'm aware of actually set up a marquee board in front where they'll put like a checkoff list, if you will. And the dancers know exactly what calls were covered last session, what calls are being covered tonight, and what calls are going to be covered in the next session. And as they progress through the marquee board, they'll check off on the basis of tonight, this call was just introduced last week, for example. So tonight we'll still dance the call and consider heavy cues on it the first night, and then gradually diminish the cues down as you progress through the marquee board as the sessions go through on the particular call. That way you're somewhat organized, and the dancer will benefit from that organization because it'll become viable then at the level. You should recommend dictionaries to your dancers. I also prepare printed handouts, which are called helpful hints, about calls that you sometimes just don't get in a book, that really are helpful to the people in order to understand more about the call. When I teach a class, I teach it from the standpoint of the concept approach right away, so that I'm not going just directly into a cold definition of a call and utilize it only from one setup. They'll get it immediately from numerous different setups so that they don't get a chance to memorize any traffic pattern. You should continue studying your positions and formations that a call can be done from. I think we're all still learning different positions and ways in putting the calls together and how they can be used. That's part of the excitement of dancing and calling at this level for me. You should request your dancers to tape your program. And twice a month dancing, trying to dance at challenge when you're teaching a class, just doesn't work. I feel strongly about the fact that it's a once-a-week minimum and twice preferred. So if there is another program in your area that you can refer your dancers to, please do so. But if you're going to do that, try to coordinate with that other class or that other caller so that you're utilizing the same teaching order, so that the dancer who goes to this class in 1 week and in that same week goes to another class is going to get buried with another list of calls. If no other dance is available, then request that the dancers dance your tape between sessions, especially if they're beginning to fall behind, so that you don't have to ask them to withdraw from your program. when you hold out your shingle to start a C1 class, you get dancers with a variety of backgrounds, some of which you may not have taught. It is therefore impossible to assume that a complete and thorough knowledge of advanced has been obtained. So you have to ask yourself what minimum standards you set for entrance. I really feel that's kind of an individual thing. Since I call full-time for a living, I have to have a minimum number of squares in order to meet my expenses, and then my fee, and the level at which you set your minimum standards for. If you want to dance on that particular call on that particular night, you're going to have to take all those factors into account. I do so, and then I put forth my teaching order that will reflect those deficiencies. So each year when I teach a class, I may end up working with a completely different teaching order because I may end up having to include calls that should have already been obtained by the dancer but aren't necessarily there. Additionally, an adequate teach is not once for the heads and once for the sides. You should repeat constantly because that's the whole idea behind dancing. Challenge is this memorization of the definition and then being able to apply it. Things that challenge dancers should be taught. Hold the starting setup until all dancers understand the particular setup. Establish eye contact and pointing at spots or individuals to clarify the formation. Move carefully and deliberately through the move, pausing briefly at intermediate positions. Moves are started and finished in unison. Individuals designated by the caller should raise their hands quickly to indicate to the other dancers where they are. One of the common problems I've encountered when calling like at a plus dance or at an advanced dance, oftentimes if you have the side people at the heads of the square and you ask the heads to do something, the wrong ones go. Because dancers aren't really that tuned into, and I think it's because of the lack of caller training, that once you enter a square, once a head, always a head, regardless of where you may be in the floor or in the setup. Keep the square small and tight. Contract the square after each move if necessary, if it causes the square to expand. Many dancers dance by flow instead of by definition, so you've got to be careful of that. You should tell your dancers to watch their opposite and to watch a counterpart and explain to them those terms. Is there anybody who doesn't know what that means?
Counterpart.
Find a dancer that is in another square in the same relationship to the square that you're in. Should you become lost in the square, you can then immediately check off in the adjacent square and find what relative spot on the floor that dancer is occupying, and then you can then go to that spot on the square to try to fill the spot so that the square can maintain its dancing. Traps for the caller to avoid. The insecure caller's ego. There are a lot of top dancers out there who might come to your dance who understand the choreography better than you, the caller. You've got to be able to accept that. A lot of callers can't. The inability of the caller to disseminate knowledge because they don't know, they bluff their way through. I've seen a lot of callers try to bluff their way through something and end up really messing up a lot of people because now that forces them to have to unlearn something. There's nothing wrong with admitting to a floor if you don't know how it goes. Just promise them that you'll check it out and give them a report the next session. Challenge is a new language. It's a different form of communicating, and the caller with little time or laziness or an unwillingness to work shouldn't even try it. Callers should be careful of interpreting moves as they see fit. You may be conflicting with established rules already set before you enter this part of the activity. What will you get out of challenge calling? Well, in the beginning, a lot less money for a lot more work, but a higher exhilaration. You can do more with more calls and more positioning. It's more fun to call to dancers who start to approach a much higher level of ability. Dancers can relate to you better, and the level of communication has been raised. It'll help eliminate your boredom of having to be so repetitive with the same calls. You also get comfort in the knowledge that you are keeping someone in the square dancing movement who might otherwise go bowling. By having a place to offer dancers, you can maintain regular contact and enjoy the friendship of the dancers for a longer period of time. As dancers progress through the levels, their contact with you will be reduced unless you can offer them their C1 training. On my home program, I run my C1 classes as closed groups by invitation only. I refer elsewhere those dancers who can't cut it, even after the class is closed. Just because they were initially invited is not a mandate that they can stay. So they have to continue working towards their goal to keep up with the rest of the floor. I use a random mixing of the floor, the computer or numbers, so that it evens out the level on the floor. I use the first year to teach a class. I usually teach a 9-month program and then spend 3 months to review it and then move them into another group that dances for a 1-year period before I call them national level C1 dancers. If you find a challenge for you, go out there and have fun, because there's a whole new world waiting for you.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I'm sure you know, I noticed in listening to what he said, at least 80% of everything he said applied to advanced dancing also, right? A lot of the same philosophy and then things, but then carried another step further in the challenge. Before we move on to Tom, does anybody have any questions based on what Dave just said that you want to ask Dave? Yeah, and if you can go to the mic then.
One time, my name is Steve Wendell from Los Angeles. One time, there are times when you find questions about certain calls, maybe an application, is it legal from a certain type of formation? Where does one go? What is the best way to resolve those types of questions, even at the advanced, possibly even at the plus level? You know, I mean, this is applicable all the way around, but what is the best way to resolve those kinds of questions? Who do you talk to?
Since I've not yet seen a dictionary or an encyclopedia or a reference book that's 100% on everything, I think the only thing you can do is to contact a more experienced caller and ask firsthand what goes on before you start applying it to the dance. What I hate to see is a caller that will apply it to the dance, get caught in a trap, and then try to check it out. Better you should check it out first.
Dave's right. You can't strictly rely on any one book or publication. However, in looking at the definition of a call, you want to try to understand the concept, as Dave said. The concept of the call is the overriding factor generally on what's legal and what isn't legal. And then within that concept, what is the exact wording of the call? There are a lot of callers that I find both at Advance and Challenge. They'll be calling something and they say to themselves, I know I'm not really sure whether this is right or not, but I don't have anybody to ask, so I'll call it. And they call it this way for a year. And all of a sudden here comes through town the caller who they say, well, gee, this guy will know the answer. I'll ask him the question. So they ask him the question, and the guy says, no, you're doing it wrong. And the caller says, fine, I'll change. But he's been calling it wrong for a year. And how many dancers has he affected for that year? Better the first night, he picked up the phone and called this caller or any caller that he knows in the country that has the answer. And I always tell everybody this, pick up the phone, no caller minds having you call him at dinner hour or whatever when he's home and just say, how do you do an AC-doozy from an inverted line? I don't understand it. And the caller tells you, and fine, and sure, it's cost you the price of a phone call, but it's a lot better that than the embarrassment of later on having to go back to the dancer and say, gee, for the last year I've been calling this wrong. And the dancers kind of raise their eyes, that kind of thing. Yeah. Just go behind him there. Go ahead. You're there. Go ahead, Jay.
Okay, I'm Jay Clausen from California. I have a basic question about the referee. I am concerned. Where would you go to establish a referee for a definition of a call as it's being used? The thing that frequently happens is you go ahead and teach it, okay? And you teach it in as close an interpretation as you can apply to the definition as it exists, and then you send the dancers loose, and they go out and they get blown off the floor when the thing is applied from a different formation or a different set of circumstances that the definition technically allows. I'm concerned about that. Is there a move afoot to try and get the challenge calls defined? And does the definition include starting and ending formation? I contend every definition has to include starting and ending formation. Did you see the press calls?
Yeah, the challenge list will be defined the same as the advanced list, but that program will not be started until the advanced list definitions are done. So that's why they're done
May I
now.
make one suggestion when you decide to do that? Don't put starting formation, various. Various does not tell me one thing. Okay?
Yeah, all the formations should be listed, right? Did you?
But that's an impossible task.
Yeah, sometimes, right, as they said, it's not always possible to list every single starting formation, especially when you get in at challenge with T-bones on the list and you get T-bone formations, you start listing every formation and there's no room for the definition because all you have down are formations.
You can indicate various T-bones.
You indicated that if you teach the call by the definition and they go to a dance somewhere and get blown off the floor, then obviously there's a problem. Either you're not using the right definition or the caller that's calling that particular call is not utilizing it from a correct formation.
Okay, I'll give you an example. Okay? Left hand, 1/4, tag. Chain reaction. It's an illegal call.
It is an illegal call?
Yes. The definition says 1/4 tag. It does not say left hand 1/4 tag. And 1/4 tag is not assumed to be left-handed. It's assumed to be right-handed.
Well, see, one of the things you have to keep in mind, if you're going to go into challenge, you're going to have to maintain an open mind. If you're looking for a set of rules that are, it's done from this position, this position, this position, and if it doesn't fall in that category, it's not allowable, then
how are you going to be fair to your dancers if you don't specify exactly what you mean? That's what I'm trying to tell you.
Part of the aspect...
It's not my problem about keeping the open mind. I can keep the open mind all right.
And you have to impart that knowledge to your dancer, or they have no business being involved in this portion of the activity.
Another example would be from ocean waves. From ocean waves, all 8 circulate, and the starting formation is ocean waves. Now that presumes right-handed waves and left-handed waves, but we don't say left-handed waves.
True.
So it'd be the same with quarter tag. Now, true, you are correct, technically quarter tag is right-handed, but we're talking about the general formation. I would concede you 10% on your point, but I would say the other 90% is that is the formation, and any formation can have different hands and apply the definition to that formation. The dancer, if they're trained in the definition, and all of a sudden they get hit with it from a left quarter tag formation, the first thing that should go through their mind is, what is the definition? The first thing is those facing pass through. They always go back to the definition, forget the starting formation. If it's called on a halfway up the wall, the first thing they think, what's the definition?
That isn't the definition, but that's okay.
Additionally...
No, it isn't. No, it isn't.
For the longest time...
610 hinge.
For the longest time in our area, callers were coming through on the road and at an advanced level calling chain reaction from almost every position allowable because it was on the advanced list with that little addendum on the bottom that APD was allowable at this level. And I think one of the things that we did here at this CALLERLAB convention was to try and restrict to a right-hand quarter tag setup a chain reaction. And at C1, we allow for it to be done from a left-handed quarter tag formation.
Well, Dave, I'm on the formations committee, and I know the difference between right-hand 1/4 tag and left-hand 1/4 tag, and they are 2 separate formations. I know that.
All right, so at the advanced level, a right-hand quarter tag formation chain react is the way it ought to be done. And as you go up through the level, different formations are going to be allowable for this call. At the advanced level, it's unfair for you to write down all of the allowable formations that this call can be done from because the advanced dancer is beyond their scope.
I'm sorry, I disagree, Dave.
That was it's intentional with all the definitions at every level, mainstream or plus or advanced, that you only list the formations that are applicable to that level. For all 8 circulate at mainstream, they don't say an applicable position is T-bones because we aren't using T-bone circulate at mainstream. When we come along to challenge, now T-bone is a viable formation. That's why left 1/4 tag formation is not listed for advanced as a starting formation, because we have opted that it should only be done from the right 1/4 tag at challenge. I mean, at advanced level.
Okay, let's assume that I have a friendly little caller that comes out there, calls an advanced dance. He calls it from left hand 1/4 tag. Should I tell all my dancers to go ask for their money back? That'll stop it. As soon as the dancers go out there and ask for their money back and you take it out of his pocket, it'll stop.
And I'm not even sure if at advanced we've limited it to only right 1/4 tag. It might be left 1/4 tag also. I'm not sure.
No, at advanced it's limited to right-hand 1/4 tag.
Okay. Yeah.
That's what it's been recommended.
Okay. Let's go on with let's have just these two remaining questions, and then I want to go on to Tom and get his comments, and then we'll come back more questions, and I'll make some. We'll kind of go back and forth like that.
Mike Callahan from Rochester area, New York. Could you expand upon why you think it should be necessary to use cue cards when you're first starting? If you become halfway or proficient calling A1 and A2 sight calling, don't you think that cue cards would be some kind of a crutch to start the C1 and not develop a real sight calling to it?
Okay, part of the problem that you're going to run into when you do sight calling, we're all victims of falling into traps. We repeat things, and those traps are going to give your dancers a very narrow range of what challenge is all about. And by doing cards, it forces you into doing other things in other areas. You see callers doing it this way, so forth. And by doing these cards, it's not something that you would naturally fall into on sight calling techniques. You're going to revert back to your old system. By doing these cards, you're giving your dancers now a more well-rounded program of what challenge is about. I maintain that it's impossible for a dancer to arrive at challenge-level dancing by dancing exclusively to one caller. It cannot be done. And it's that same reasoning that we use cards so that you can get a more diverse program to your dancer to make them more accomplished in the field.
I would agree that you don't need cards initially to teach your first class. You can, as long as you have a list of all the calls and the formations and you're a super sight caller and just go with that, that's fine. But don't then book a C1 dance out somewhere and have no cards, because you'll likely have big trouble there. As your group becomes more proficient, you will now want to write cards for them. But I would say no, cards are not a requirement to start in and teach your first C1 class. But you should have cards when you go out to call any C1 dance that you're hired for, because if they're real weak C1, you can get away with no cards. But they might not be. And then all of a sudden, the worst thing in the world is to go up there and have no material.
Ben Rubright, Charlotte, North Carolina. Just a note about the referee. I believe there's no better way to become a challenge caller than to first become a challenge dancer. Before I taught my C1 class, I was a C2 dancer. And I think if you have any thoughts about needing referees, once you've danced a while, you know pretty quick who the good callers really are and who the ones that aren't quite that good are. And the material they do will tell you what you can do and what is acceptable. Secondly, second point, just because the rule of a call permits it to be called from a certain formation, if you're the only guy in the world calling it from that formation, forget it. And if somebody else comes in to call to your dancers, and they're the only guy that calls a follow your neighbor and spread from a 1/4 tag, they're going to forgive you, because that's the only place they're going to see it. So don't waste their time. Thank you.
One other follow-up on his statement. I said in my opening remarks that you really have to be a challenge dancer before you can become a challenge caller. You can probably go out, if you've done enough advanced work in preparing cards, and and call a C1 dance. But if you're going to teach a C1 class, it's my personal recommendation that you dance at least one level higher than what you're planning on teaching.
Okay, Tom.
Just lean to your left side. I can put the hat.
Okay, my program is a little different than what some of these gentlemen are describing, in that I'm not in a real urban area. Luckily, we are within 100 miles of 3 major urban areas, which would be Cleveland, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh. The number of people that I'm talking about I have to work with are probably 6 to 10 couples generally. Now this, of course, becomes a problem if I have to drive a total trip of 130 miles, round trip. So we must, to make our program successful, combine not only sessions with the caller, but also taped sessions. And of course, there are many good tapes on the market, right, Ed?
Not necessarily.
The dancers must be willing to accept new calls on a more frequent basis. And of course, for some reason our group tends to be in the 40s and 50s age bracket. I think this is because they do have more time to spend with the program that they're working on. And also some of them seem to have, let's say, the means to spend more time. They have the means to travel and spend more time with the program, whether it be time-wise or monetary. And they have to be willing to. Most of our people are traveling to Cleveland, Buffalo, or Pittsburgh, and this involves a 200-mile round trip for them. Some of them are doing this twice a week, so that's 400 miles. Entry level is not real structured. I find the only people that come to me and are interested in this are people who are willing to spend the time and to follow through. We've been very fortunate with attitude, and I consider attitude a major factor here. By attitude, I mean I like my dancers to support previous levels. I don't think they should detach themselves from the advanced program or even the plus program. We've been very fortunate. I would say 90% of my dancers not only come and support the advanced dances and workshops I have, but they also support a plus level club. And I mean support not just by being there, they are members and also on other committees. Now, for some of these people, this means up to 6 or 7 nights a week they're involved in the square dance activity. That's fine. That's what some of them want. The reason I like this type of attitude is because we keep good PR relations with their fellow dancers. They don't feel that they have been left behind just because one couple feels that they want to, try another program or dance a different type of call or anything like this. And this is very important. Previous knowledge, of course, should be very thorough. That's pretty obvious. As Dave mentioned about some of the dancers being prepped sometimes a little better than the callers, they subscribe to note services too and do a lot of reading and a lot of study at this particular level. Some of them have a tendency to bring a new call back to you. Some of the new calls that come out, maybe it's something you haven't worked with or maybe you've just heard the name of, and they proceed to explain how you do it from, various positions. I think you owe it to yourself not to use it that evening, but to check it out first. There have been cases where this has even been instructed incorrectly to this dancer. And should you, of course, present it to the floor, he tells you the starting position and the ending position, so naturally you should be able to just plug it in anywhere. Check it out. Don't let them, and this could apply at any level, but don't let them, snow you on this. Personally, as myself, I did not necessarily have more time to prepare on the choreography. This was not all my doing. No one else in the area would necessarily, in the immediate area, accept the responsibility for doing any of this type of thing. So I suppose this is how many of us had gotten started in calling originally. Somebody had to accept the responsibility. So I did take on the program myself, however small it may be. And it is rewarding in a number of ways, as Dave has mentioned, and not necessarily monetarily. Okay. Any questions?
I just wanted, if it's real easy, we can just repeat it over the mic. If it's long and involved, you can.
When you say you accepted the responsibility for this program, were you calling C1? Were you calling C1 then, or did you,
Yeah, that question is long enough that you probably should go to the mic.
Tom, when you said you accepted responsibility to run this program, were you calling C1 then, or did you, when you started the group, did you more or less, take each call and work one call a night, or had you had some kind of a background in it already?
I did have a basic background with it. I've been involved as far as dancing at some time before that, prior to that. What was the other part of your question about the...
That's basically, I just wonder how you got into it.
Okay, I had been calling... I was trying to be familiar enough with it that, let's say, for instance, I've been doing more festivals recently and things like that, that I would be prepared to call, let's say, a star tip, or like one tip, or let's say C1, because I have worked with advanced for some time. But to feel comfortable, I wanted to know something about calling at least a tip of it. So then, of course, this took it a step farther by getting involved with a group. And
That's my situation right now, and that's why
I still would be hesitant to book a full C1 dance, but this gives them enough that they can, and this again is important, that they seek further instruction or go to other C dances, dance to other callers, and of course they can do this. Now, some of them can't do this frequently when it involves a 200-mile round trip, that is every week, but they do get out of the area and into surrounding urban areas and able to get more festivals, this type of thing.
I just wanted to elaborate just on a couple of things that Dave mentioned. He pointed out that you must be willing to use cue cards, and there are a number of areas that I go into that applies both to advanced and C1 where the dancers say, well, this guy is working advanced or is working C1 in our area, and that's great because we're really glad to have him. But gee, the dances every week, it just kind of drags because he won't use cue cards, and we keep telling him that's what you do in challenge, and he just won't do it, and he just resists us on this. So I want to emphasize that that's what you have to do at challenge. Once you've graduated your class and you're starting to call for them, you have to write material and use cue cards. You can't indefinitely go along with the crutch of sight calling. Also, once you've graduated your class and you're into C1, especially if you're ever going to book C1 dances any place, listen to other callers' tapes and pull ideas off of the tapes. There's no way that any caller can think up everything that's going to be done or can be done. And also, you want to be aware that you want to be giving your dancers what's being done in the activity. And you find that out by listening to other callers' tapes and say, gee, I never thought of that idea, but that's pretty logical, and because it's pretty logical, it must mean some other callers are doing that too, so I better do it. And the only way you got that idea was to get it from the tape. So I can't emphasize enough, listen to other callers doing live C1 dances and pull off ideas off of their tapes. Understanding...
That presupposes that you don't have the time to go to the dance live to start with, because that's by far preferred.
And since there aren't that many challenge callers in the country, I mean, there are only, on our committee, there's 45, and that isn't all the challenge callers, but say there's 100 callers in the country calling challenge. A lot of those tend to be in the big metropolitan areas, so it may not be possible to get, in the majority of cases, to get to a live challenge dance. I want to emphasize and give you the key phrase that in challenge all the dancers know this phrase and all the callers, and it's kind of the Bible sentence. And I want to impart this to you to be your Bible sentence and for you to impart it to your dancers. And the sentence is, if you don't know the definition, you don't know the call. Very important. And a lot of dancers will say, well, I can't tell you what the definition is, but when the caller calls it, I can dance it. Sure, they can dance it because they're watching other people in the square and kind of going with the flow. But if that square ever has any trouble, they're going to be the first ones to break down. That phrase, if you don't know the definition, you don't know the call, is very important right from beginner level and mainstream on up. But for each succeeding level, it becomes more and more important. Okay, question.
Yes, I have two things. My name is Jeff Keeler from Grand Blanc, Michigan. First is an elaboration on the writing the cue cards. Second is a question. On the first, I think that once you become able to write cards, you will feel a big burden come off your shoulders once you go to the dance. It's hard to spend that time prior to the dance writing cards, but you'll surprise yourself on the ideas that you can come up with. You'll surprise yourself at the reaction of the dancers and how much more they enjoy the dance when you have the variety of a cue card. You don't have to worry about whose corners necessarily unless either the card doesn't work or unless they do it right or don't do it right. You can sight out fine. That's where your ability as a sight caller comes in. That's my elaboration.
Can I just jump in one thing on the cue cards? And this is a method that I would say the majority of challenge callers use, and they use it right up C2 and C3. anytime you use a cue card, it automatically tends to make the dance more difficult, just from the fact that it's one call after another and it's written down. If you use cue cards all night for a group that cannot handle that intensity, then you drive them away. So a lot of callers will sight call a while, then go to a cue card. And what they'll do, they have the cue card laying there, and they glance down and see what are the toughy parts of this cue card. And then they sight call each of those parts. You're setting the dancers up for success. Once you sight call them through all the hard parts, now you come on with the big thing of giving them the cue card. Then you take your next cue card and do that. Sight call a while, then give them the cue card. Now, obviously, you wouldn't do that if you're calling for a solid C1 group that just wants cards all the time. But this method of sight calling back and forth and then using occasional cue cards is a method that's used a lot, especially for C1 people that are not real strong C1 dancers. Okay, and then your next.
My question was, this is the way I got started in challenge dancing, is that I worked with a local tape leader. Now, a local tape leader usually is a higher advanced dancer. He came to one of my club dances and asked if I wanted to go into advanced dancing. Well, my wife and I found out that we opened up a whole new world for ourselves as far as dancing. And what he has done is he has worked with me to help establish the clubs. He's also taught me as I went, and I'm dancing about a level higher than what I'm teaching. We have 2 clubs now. But I think working with a tape leader, if he is willing to, will be enormous help to a new caller coming up. And I don't know if you know of a local tape leader in your area, but it sure helped me when I started.
And that goes right back to what Dave says. You have to get rid of the ego aspect that I'm the caller and therefore I know more than the dancers. That is probably true through mainstream and plus, but when you get to advanced and definitely at C1, there are a lot of dancers that know more than we do because they're dancing tapes to all the callers and we're just one caller. And if you can get rid of that negative aspect of I'm not going to listen to any of the dancers, if you start listening to the dancers, boy, they can give you a wealth of information. What's this caller doing? What's this caller doing? Encourage your dancers who know more than you do to tell you if you're doing something wrong. A lot of the super knowledgeable dancers, like the tape leader, they will be hesitant to criticize you for fear of antagonizing you and driving you out of challenge. So they may tend to hold back and not say anything. So you have to go out of your way ahead of time to encourage them. I want this feedback. If I'm doing something wrong, tell me. You won't upset me, and this will benefit you and the dancers all along the line. Okay, other questions or comments here?
This aspect that Jeff brought up goes along with attitude. We had a very negative thing happen that affected a festival in our area just very recently, beginning of this month. One of the so-called tape leaders went up and told the caller it was okay to call, da-da-da-da, gave him this list of stuff. And this had not been advertised as such. And, of course, this created some problems, and not in entirety, in that they did have star tips available, but created a situation that really should not have arisen. And there again, if we had the communications going between the tape leader and the caller in the area and in several other ways or circles, this, would not have had to be.
When you start embarking upon challenge and you start seeing these allowable formations, one of the things I'd like to caution you about, and that is,
just as you wouldn't call late circulate from a 3-in-1 line necessarily for new mainstream dancers or maybe even experienced mainstream dancers. Same type of thing at challenge. That's one thing where some new challenge callers get into trouble. They say, here's the definition, and since it's all position, that means I should do it from every position right away. And you get into all some weird things, and the people are kind of going a little bananas. I want to give my concept of kind of what the philosophy of different challenge levels are. Some people think that once you hit challenge, boy, that's a knockdown, drag-out thing because it's a word challenge and we're really going to go to town here. And that really isn't the case. In challenge, as at any level, you can have relaxed, you can have middle of the road, and you can have hard. You can have relaxed C1, you can have middle of the road C1, and you can have a real hard, difficult C1. I feel that the overriding philosophy at C1 is that while it is another step beyond advanced level in terms of knowledge and degree of intensity, it does not reach the intensity level and the commitment to big, heavy study that is required, say, at C2 and C3. And some new callers coming into C1 don't stop and realize this. They say, well, if it's challenge, it must mean it's 100% full throttle all the way. And that's not really the case. Recognize also that a lot of people go into C1 because they are perennial workshoppers. They may never want to be, quote, good C1 dancers. They just want to workshop the calls. And I find a lot of this around the country. People would rather workshop than dance, because then at a workshop, the caller always stops and helps them through. Well, can have too much of that also. But recognize some people may go into a C1 workshop and never really want to become solid C1 dancers. They may just want to workshop and play around with the calls. And so if you hit them over the head with a lot of hard material, then all of a sudden, if the philosophy of your group is such that they don't ever want to go on and become solid C1, then all of a sudden you have the night open, like Dave says, and you have to judge your calling to what your particular group wants.
And did you tell your dancers whether it's relaxed or hard?
Okay, would I tell my dancers whether it's relaxed or hard? The answer is yes. I will always tell the dancers what level I feel I'm calling for them, so that then they don't go out and get overwhelmed somewhere else. For instance, if my group is a relaxed C1 group, I will tell them, you are a relaxed C1 group, and if you go out to a solid C1 level, you may be in over your head. I'm not saying don't go out, but I'm just saying be aware of that, so that you recognize the difference. And then that also is an insurance policy for myself. They don't come back and say, well, boy, you didn't train us to go out there. I can come back and say, the level of this group is relaxed C1, and I told you that, and recognize that there are 2 more levels of C1 beyond that. So I always make sure, especially if the level is relaxed at any level, I always be sure I tell the dancers that, so they don't think they're solid at that level, and then they go out somewhere else and get blown away. Yeah.
I have a question about the difference between calling at a festival and calling at, say, a local advanced or C1 club. How do you handle that difference? And I know that a lot of callers stand to be really burned if they call to a festival the way they call to their local advanced dancers. The level of the floor at a festival is considerably down. And how do you handle that, and how do you work with that?
The way I handle it is I say everything at a festival is always below what you're going to call for your home group. And if I go into a C1 floor, a C2 floor at the National Convention, I'm not going to try to show off anything. I'm just going to call a nice roll and tip, because I'm only in there for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and there's 50 other guys coming after me. So I want them to dance, and I'm not really, the only thing I'm looking to show off is the fact that I can keep them dancing and keep them dancing at a nice rolling pace. And where some guys get into trouble is they go into these rooms with the thought, well, gee, I've just followed a Keith Gelly or a Lee Compton, and boy, I got to really call hard. And they call hard, and nobody dances. And then everybody remembers them because for the fact that nobody danced, and so they'll never dance to them again. So it's a philosophy, it's a trap philosophy. A lot of callers feeling they have to call too hard on these floors at festivals, and that isn't the case. The dancers there are really just looking for a nice, relaxed, comfortable thing to go along with. Unless you get to, say, it's a hard C2 or hard C3, you have maybe only 2 or 3 squares in there, and they're looking for that. Fine, that's a whole other ballgame. You do festivals.
One of the things that I do when I do a festival is a bit of advice that was given to me early on when I first started calling. I was a novice caller, and I got a chance to call for somebody else's group for a party night, and I spent hours and days in preparation of a program. And I got there, and the whole thing fell apart because I couldn't use the program. And one of the master callers that were there at the dance came up to me and recognized my dilemma. And he said, the secret to programming when you're on the road of that type is to always have prepared an easy, middle, and hard program and call a little bit out of each one. And in so doing, if the dancer is expecting a 70% success rate and you're doing a hard sequence, you're giving some of the people out on the floor an opportunity to dance their particular segment and thereby maintaining the 70% for the floor, which is what's expected of the level.
Okay, one thing I want to to ask is that several times in the LA area, okay, there have been C1 dances that were listed, and they were offered, and they bring the caller in, and I would go to that dance, and in addition to everything on the C1 list, calls from the other list, C2, would bleed down onto that list. Now, the dance level was listed as a C1. Now, I want to know what happens along the way, because there is like a general attitude that, okay, it's a C1 dance, but there are additional calls that invariably wind up down on the C1 list that are not listed on that list. I mean, can you address that at all? Because it seems to be fairly common. You know, I mean, if you're going to list a C1 dance, why is that not held within the listing of the C1 calls, and why does this bleeding occur from the higher levels down?
Well, the first time it happens, it's probably an error. The second time and repeated times it happens might be because after the first error, the floor was able to do it. One of the things I do to solve a problem for myself personally, I color code all my cards so that therefore each particular stack of cards by color is a level. So I don't have to worry about pulling into a particular dance a card that's outside the scope of this floor. That sometimes is a mistake made by callers, and that may be what you're encountering. They'll start reading the card and they'll go, oh, well, I don't want to cite it out. It's got a neat ending. I want to get to it. So we'll just kind of take them a little carefully in a little bit more directions over the humps in this thing and take them through the card.
What you mentioned is, unfortunately, a somewhat common practice by some callers at Challenge, which I am totally against. I don't feel there should be one C2 call in a C1 dance. If a guy makes a mistake and slips one in once or twice, and it's truly a mistake, fine. But once you get to the sixth or seventh time, then it's no longer a mistake. I feel the dancers should complain, but the dancers don't complain. So the dancers are part of the problem themselves because they don't complain. There's a second aspect to this, however. There's the aspect of C2 calls at C1 dances, which I said I'm totally against. There's also the aspect of currently popular experimentals that are being used. And this is kind of the aspect of you have to know what's going on in the challenge activity. And at any given time, there are probably about 4 hot experimentals at Challenge. And it's really up to those people to be aware of them through their caller or through their tape. And it's not the caller's fault if he throws them in and you haven't had it because for some reason your caller hasn't given it to you. It's his fault. Or you haven't danced tapes for 6 months, and then it's your fault. It's not his fault for throwing that kind of thing in. Right. Now, if he throws in 15 experimentals, ones that are being used C2 and C3, now that's another ballgame. The general rule of thumb that I've always carried for myself is that at Challenge, people are supposed to know 4 or 5 currently popular experimentals. At C2, it gets to about 12, and at C3, it gets more than that. This is a basic rule of thumb that I've had for myself. But coming back to C2 calls at C1, C1 calls at Advance, it's this whole thing, and the CALLERLAB office gets complaints all the time, plus calls being used at Mainstream. This isn't just limited to a C1 problem. This is rampant throughout, and this is one of the reasons why one of these addendums that Van Antwerp has for the ethics committee to be added to this ethics thing is because of the number of complaints that are going on about this. But to me, the bottom line is the dancers. If the dancers don't complain at the dance, and then later on they go home and complain, they've almost voided their right to complain. They should complain right there, and they should just make it aware of that they're upset. Now, a lot of callers will say, well, there's 15 squares on a floor, and I called a C2 call, and 12 of them got it. So, therefore, I go with the majority of the floor. And I can understand their thinking, but I don't go along with it because those other 3 squares should not have to suffer for that. Those 3 squares should complain. Maybe that's just my philosophy. But again, most people don't complain, and so we have the thing keeps going around in a circle.
So in other words, what you're saying then is if that call, even if it in that instance they call a C call on a Mainstream or Advanced floor, and they can do it. Okay, you get a majority of the people doing it. In other words, you feel that call still does not belong on that in that level because it is out of the advertised level of that dance. Okay.
That's another reason it's important for the dancers to do the complaining, because we've had a couple cases where these dancers are not sponsored by dancers, they're sponsored by non-dancers, and of course they cannot be aware of what the situation is in entirety. In fact, they know little if nothing about square dancing when they're non-dancer. So there again, the dancer should bring it up.
There's another excuse. The callers, if the dancers go up and complain, the callers will sometimes say, "Oh well, it just slipped in. I did it by mistake." And we're talking about the 10th and 12th and 15th time. And to me, my reply is, the challenge callers, by virtue of the knowledge and study that they've had to do, are probably the most knowledgeable callers in the world in terms of choreography and calls, and it's their responsibility to know what calls are on a list. And I don't accept the excuse, well, I didn't think about it. It's every caller's responsibility to know every call on every list. And if you're calling plus, you should know every call on that, and know if you even think of an advanced call, you mentally say, I don't call it, I know where that is. I know it's on advanced, or I know it's on C1. And to me, it's a lazy cop-out for the caller to say, well, I just didn't think about where it was, and the majority forgot it, so I'll keep using it.
At Glen Zeno Soccer Man, it shouldn't be pointed out that you can use call from a higher level if you workshop it.
Right. If you workshop, you can use anything at any level if you workshop it. Of course, we have the effect of caller judgment. If you workshop a C3 call in an advanced dance, it's probably too hard and the whole floor goes down the drain. But that's caller judgment, that it is not a case of using the wrong call at a level. But right, CALLERLAB has always taken the position, I think most callers do, that as long as you workshop a call, no matter where it's from, then you can use it at that level.
Just one other comment on the bleeding down of the lists. In our part of the country, down North Carolina way, we tend to have weekends that are annual. Same callers, and primarily the same dancers. So this year's C1 dancer tends to be maybe a C1.5 to a C2 dancer next year. However, the weekend stays at C1. And after you have done this for 5 or 6 years, you still have now C3 dancers coming to this C1 dance. It's primarily the same crowd. And there apparently is a tremendous pressure on the callers, knowing that they've got 80% of their floor C3 dancers. And this is a C1 dance. And I think it's this, not direct pressure, but the mere presence of the dancers, the higher level dancers there, that makes the caller feel intimidated into raising the level. And it's kind of what Dave alluded to about having a floor full of dancers who know a lot more than what you're hired to call.
But on the other hand, those dancers should not be at that weekend expecting anything higher.
Absolutely right. And so I don't defend the practice, right. I just mean to point it out.
And so the callers should be mentally aware enough. The callers should not let themselves get mentally psyched out by C3 dancers at a C1 dance. They should say, fine, these C3 dancers are here because they enjoy a C1 dance. They have come out to relax and have a nice C1 time. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to maybe use them more for my sight calling to go to a corner, but I'm not going to look to try to make them, satisfy them at a C3 concept at a C1 dance.
One of the traps, though, that you often fall into is that when you've got a full square stacked of C3 people in front of you at a C1 weekend and you're using them exclusively as a sight calling square, you're going to start calling to them. Their reaction time is going to be much improved over what the capability of the floor can handle, and you've buried the floor just on sheer tempo alone, and that's a real trap that you've got to be careful of too. So when I see a stacked square in front, well, due to some experience, that usually tells me that I'm in trouble if I watch because they're going to play. So what I try to do instead is I'll try to pick a square that's marginal or at least middle of the road of floor level and watch and sight to that particular square and safety valve off to this if I need them to come back to. But don't make that your primary square to watch if you're sight calling, because that's at the expense of the floor.
Holler up if you ever want to say anything, because I never can see you.
One short comment. we maybe should evaluate when we're advertising these things the level that goes on the flyer. For instance, I'm chairman of the Rural Area Considerations Committee, and one of the interesting points that came up this time was dances being advertised as plus, and when the caller actually called them, they were mostly or predominantly mainstream, with only 1 or 2 plus calls that normally, show up in singing calls or very frequently. And I'm wondering if at the other end of the scale, this thing is happening in reverse. But they may want to consider revamping the flyer in this, something like in this case you're talking about.
I have no qualms at labeling a flyer relaxed C1 or relaxed advanced. That gets the pressure off me of these people coming in expecting a real solid C1. If it says relaxed C1 on the flyer, because that's the majority of the people, now that takes away this pressure of the super C1 dancer or C2 dancer there saying, well, call harder. And I say, hey, it says right in the flyer, your expectation should be what the level was on the flyer. That word relaxed really conveys a good impression if you're going to call or relax anything, relax advanced or relax C1, and I found good success with that on flyers.
Yeah, Norm Wilcox, Ontario, Canada. Just to get totally off the subject, I am involved in advanced programs, but not in challenge at all, and I'm in here to try and understand start with challenge movement. But one question I have, up to advanced dancing, we're looking at dancing which flows and which dancers can flow from one move to the next with minimal or no stopping. That is, it's flowing movement. Does this aspect continue on into challenge? And secondly, I sort of look at 2 types of choreography. One which is flow choreography, which I sort of call puzzle choreography, where it's a mental challenge to the dancer to puzzle his way through something which you're offering him and requires more thinking time. Does this aspect enter into challenge more as you go?
Yeah, we really have those same 2 types of choreography from mainstream on up. At mainstream, the flow is 99.9%. At plus level, the flow is 95%, and you'll throw in an occasional puzzler. At advanced, maybe your puzzlers will now be up to 10%. At C1, maybe your puzzlers are 20 or 25%. At C2, maybe the puzzlers are 40%. Some callers may even have them 70 or 80%. So you always have the 2 types of choreography at any level you call. And the question is, how much more do you increase the puzzler aspect as you increase in your level? And I would say at C1, it depends on the caller. We all say we all want it to flow all the time, but we all know that at C1, a lot of us use puzzle combinations, and so now it comes down to an individual caller. Dave may use puzzle combinations 10%, I may use it 20%, somebody else may use it 50%, and that's just a case of your philosophy of what C1 should be. And if your philosophy at C1 should be all flow with no puzzles, that's no problem. That's no problem. It really comes down to caller philosophy and judgment for that, as the same as it would be for advanced or any level.
Bob Furman, St. Louis, Missouri. You mentioned something on the flyers a while ago, and I came in here thinking about getting into challenge. I'm involved primarily into advanced. But on the flyers, I have had some limited A1 dances, okay, for people that are in my A workshop right now, just starting. And I'll take that flyer on a limit and say A1 through number 26, 27, 28, whatever, okay? Then just call that level. And don't, or if I include something past that number, I'll say 26 plus number 35, such and such, whatever it might be, okay? And can you do the same thing with the challenge type flyer of limiting your say C calls through such and such a call or something like that?
I've seen that done, and what they do on those flyers is they'll list, this is a limited C1 dance, here are the calls that are going to be used, and they're kind of small print because you can't put them in big print, but they're like down the bottom of the page, and maybe there's maybe 30 or 40 calls listed down there.
Okay, the reason I ask this is because as I go along with the A program, I try to have another night for my A people to actually dance what they're workshopping. Now, I try to teach each workshop as a dance, where they may learn a couple of things, and then the rest of the night, we don't workshop anything else, we just dance what we've learned and what we learned previous. Then when they come to a dance, then they don't get any workshop. They dance it. Okay, on another night. And that's why I list them on the flyers as, these levels,
plus this call or
Right.
something
There's
like
no
that.
problem. The list of calls on the flyers, and it is done. So that again, there's no problem in that.
I'd like to know these attendance. What's your attendance differential on your dance versus your workshop?
Well, let's see. My dances are usually higher because of the situation we have in our area that we have some people that are dancing at much higher levels than what I'm calling the dance at, but they will come to the dance to support the advanced level, hoping that maybe later on they'll get someone into their challenge tape group, because we have no one doing challenge in our area right now on a regular basis, okay? We have absolutely no one.
So where is it from again?
St. Louis.
Okay. Okay, other... What happened? All your C1 dancers went to C2, is what?
Right. No, what it is they're not doing it to live callers. They have you've done some weekends in
They're
St.
doing
Louis,
it to tapes, right?
but they're doing it to tapes. There's no live caller actually workshopping and teaching anything above advanced right now.
Right, okay, that's right.
Mike Jacobs, Louisville, Kentucky. One solution, at least as far as a weekend format goes, to level problems and violations, etc. We just finished an advanced level weekend, Tim Scholl and myself in Kentucky. One thing that we do is that Friday night we stick exactly to the advanced level. At the Friday night dance, we pass out a questionnaire, and that questionnaire has a selection of C1 calls on it, be it easy C1 calls or useful C1 calls, and a selection of experimentals. Then the dancers then vote, in effect. They say, what calls do you know on this list? Then from that, we go through and we pick out the calls that 80 to 90% of the floor know. So that means that when they square up the next morning, we review the 5 or 6 calls that they fall into. Now, the few people that don't know have a very good chance of being in a square with 3 other couples that do know the calls, and we do a quick teach on it, and it eases itself into that quick teach situation since 90% of your floor knows the calls. From that, we are also able to determine what call hardly anyone knows, and then we tend to go to that for a workshop type format. So dancers then can individually tailor make the weekend for their own particular level, what calls they do know and what calls they don't know, and you can narrow it down to the specific area. Now, that really only solves itself for a weekend type format, but it's a good approach, and it seems to work because we've had a full weekend for the last 3 years.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. I think that's good.
It's
Especially with the levels changing constantly.
You have to buy the whole weekend.
right. You have to buy the weekend package, right?
John Marshall, Reston, Virginia. I want to go back to a little bit earlier when we were talking about flow and puzzle solving. I want to make sure we all understand, just from standpoint of clarity, because you have a situation where when we talk about puzzle solving, that's not to say that the combinations that the callers are putting together would be awkward to execute. Right? They're not saying that. Just to affect the end result of the unique puzzles being solved, you don't create a situation where certain dancers are required to do very awkward or inverted body flow, even if you slow down. What they're talking about, I think, here in flow, when Norm was questioning it, was continuous movement, forward movement, all dancing at the same time. But even when you get into some of these puzzles, the choreography, and I think you fellows will agree, needs to also be danceable. It needs to also have the ability for smooth body flow. Not necessarily moving at the same tempo. If the positions are that unusual or that difficult to see, the dancer may need extra time. Right? So you may need to help him there.
The puzzle is more like stop-start. It isn't bad flow. It's a stop-start to let everybody see
and
their
I just want to make sure they understood that, because it sounded like we were throwing body flow to the wind, and that's not it at all. It still must dance, and I think that's very critical.
Yeah, it's vital that at C1 and even at C2 and C3, body flow is always an important factor. And a lot of people that aren't involved in challenge tend to say, well, when you get to challenge, they just throw body flow out the window, and that isn't the case. We don't break anybody's back or arm at challenge, same as you do at any other level.
Yeah, Thor Sigurdsson from Manitoba, Canada. I'd like to make a question to Dave and then to Tom. You made a statement, Dave, that if your dancers come from advance, they won't be able to dance challenge. No, maybe I said that wrong. If you're the only caller who's calling advanced and they go into C1, they'll have difficulties. Now, in my area, our nearest challenge group is 350 miles one way. I mean, we're real rural, like we're 30 miles between people. And I'm the only one calling advanced in the area right now. And so I'm here hoping to maybe get into some
challenge calling, but it's going to have to be obviously really relaxed. Now, does that put a damper on me being able to go into a challenge, or would dancers that I work with, no matter how hard I work, would they be limited to where they would be able to go? Would they not be able to go to California or Pennsylvania and dance in a C1 group?
Well, part of this relaxed C1 thing versus national level C1 thing, and I call that national level because that's the typical kind of program you get when you have a national caller come through off the road into your area, and you're going to have a program whereby you're going to have to spend a lot longer for your dancer to arrive. Obviously, I would further recommend that your dancers try and supplement their dancing other than with just 2 tapes in order to arrive at a more national level program.
Many of them are doing that now. We're still only at the advanced level. So what I'm suggesting, or I'm asking, would it be difficult to take my advanced dancers into a C1 list, and at this point they're not dancing any C1 to tapes to anyone else?
Well, one time through the list is not going to make you a level dancer. You're going to have to end up getting at least a year's worth of floor time in before I would consider going to a national level program, unless the program is billed as an easy level.
Okay, I think you've answered.
What I would suggest is you teach them, if you make the decision to go to C1, you run a class and you teach them the C1. Now you start calling it. But once they've graduated and you start calling it, plan your dance night that at least 3 tips are tapes. And you do only 1 caller a night on tape, so they don't have to adjust their ear to another caller. But one night you do caller A, the next week you'll call 2 hours and they'll dance a half hour or 45 minutes to another caller, that kind of thing. Now you have to listen to those tapes first to find out what's on them and select your tips. But that's how they will get to this national level. Now that's not to say if you don't do that you couldn't get them there yourself, but history tends to say that will not happen. History tends to say that 1 caller in an isolated area working a group, it will be extremely rare for him to get those people to a national challenge C1 level because of the fact that that's the only game in town, and if those people leave, that's the end of the group. So the caller, you tend to be very conservative with them and not push them at all. Where the national level you push them a little because if they always have advanced to drop back to, or they have another challenge caller they can go to. So that's the overriding philosophy tends to be in the very rural areas, don't gamble at all. And if you don't gamble at all, you won't lose the people. But then if they go to some other big metropolitan area and dance, then they may be in over their head. So you have to recognize that factor exists and has tended to exist for many years, and the solution to that really is to work tapes along with your calling. Have them dance tapes every night for an hour or whatever to get this exposure to the callers they would be hearing when they travel.
Okay, I think that was the question I was going to ask Tom, because he mentioned tape and calling combinations, and maybe it's partly answered now.
We are fortunate in our particular area, of course, to have advanced callers within a closer driving range than we have the accomplished, C1 callers. However, in the case you're mentioning, one of the thoughts crossed my mind: are you sure you have enough for a C1 set? If you're that rural, as you're trying to describe there. But seriously, probably tapes. I think, Ed, were you just mentioning tapes in reference to the C level?
Yeah.
Okay, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea in your situation to get some good solid tapes with all the advanced calls you can get on them, just for a good backup reinforcement, and so that their skills in the advanced become very adept listening to various callers. That probably would be a good backup thing to have also, in addition to the C tapes.
And this is Jay Clausen from California. Is there any move afoot to develop a recommended teaching order for the challenge calls?
No. The reason being, and this seems to come up every year, the reason being, first of all, we've got to get the definitions. That's the first thing. But we can't get the definitions till we get the advanced definitions. Once we get the definitions, which recognize all the problems with the advanced definitions, maybe we'll get the C1 definitions by 1990. The idea is that the C1 program is not Advanced has become a very popular level with a lot of advanced callers in one area calling, and it's of benefit to be able to go back and forth and say, I'm at call number 24, and therefore we'll have a dance, and we'll get all our different groups together at that level. And you can do that, and it works because there's a lot of interest now at advanced. At C1, we recognize that the number of callers participating in C1 compared to advanced is 1/3 at best. And if you have one challenge caller in your area, you're lucky. So it's not a case of this trading back and forth, and the need just doesn't seem to be there compared with advanced.
It doesn't mean it won't be.
Right. It could be in the future, and if it is in the future, then we would address it. But the feeling is that now isn't worth going to all that hassle of trying to come up with a teaching order when it doesn't really seem to be needed the way it's needed for mainstream plus and advanced.
Since you're not too far from my area, you can have a copy of mine.
I'll take it.
Bob Furman, St. Louis, Missouri again. What do you do to overcome the tag that's been put on the higher levels of advanced and challenge dancing of it's not necessarily been taught well, but been taught grimly?
Yeah.
Well, can you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Okay, for instance, I had someone come to my group and say, we want to go back through the advanced list because when we went through the advanced list, the caller walked it through for the heads, but he never did it for the sides. We just had to stand there and watch. Okay? Then, when he said sides do it, we were expected to do it, but we really didn't have a good teach on it. So we want to learn it again. So consequently, they're very, very happy now at the advanced level with me because I try to make it fun for them, and the other people that were in the area that were doing it, they're not making it fun. I'm saying they're making it grim of, you're going to get this or I'm going to kill you.
Oh, is it a case they're making it grimmer? They just aren't teaching it the right way.
Well, okay, it's a case of both. There's cases of both, but there's one particular fella that I mean it's grim. He just takes sheer delight in grinding these people into the floor, even if it's at a workshop or a class.
Yeah, would you have that at any level, really? They'll just walk away from that caller eventually.
These people want to learn, but this particular man, for a number of years, was supposedly a recognized leader in the advanced movement in the St. Louis area. So consequently, he still gets people that come and say, you got to learn from this guy because he's the only guy that's going to teach you. And then the other aspect that we get into the C levels, because we don't have anybody doing C level live. Some of these tape groups, it's not who's the most knowledgeable, it's whoever can shout the loudest.
No, but that's a tape group problem, and it's recognized that all tape groups should have one leader and so on, so if they don't, that's their internal problem, and it's not, it's not a case I don't think that we, as callers, should worry about how their internal tape group works.
But you have to worry about it as other dancers talking to these people. I tried that once. And the only thing I ran into was a whole bunch of shouting and fighting and everything else, and I don't want to go back to it. The heck with it. Because I don't want to go through all that. And they think they're going to go through that with you, but they're not. But they won't take the chance.
Well, you have to tell them, you have to point out to them that the key to any successful tape group is you have one leader, and that's it. That's the reason, the ideal thing at any tape group really is you have one person who is a dictator. And let's face it, dictators get things done, and that's why there's so many dictators in all these countries in the world, because it may not be a democracy, but at least they're in there and they make an appearance of getting things done, where democracy tends to slow things down a little bit, but in the long run it works better. But in terms of tape groups, one strong leader who knows and everybody else keeps quiet and maybe just confers with that leader, that's the established way to do it. And if you explain to them, just as there are mistakes made at anything in life, the tape group you've been experienced with made a mistake. They had no leader. So recognize that. Recognize that? Yeah, okay. Now we're going to have a strong leader, so you're not going to have that problem anymore.
Okay.
Addressing the same thing you're talking about there, if they are a very interested person in this, you may help them be the strong leader and form their own tape group, how it should be operated. Also along the same lines, what was the other aspect you were mentioning there with that?
Of the part about it being very, very grim.
Okay, that tends to work itself out because the dancers will go work with the caller where they can succeed. I've seen that happen before at different levels. So I think that'll work itself out in a short amount of time. Probably, it'll cycle. It really will. I've seen that happen.
What are you talking about, a short amount of time?
I would say maximum 2 years.
Try so far dragging on for 6.
Okay, we're just about out of time. Ann, we have Ann be the last one.
Okay, Ann Redden, Ontario, Canada. I think we're kind of sliding past something here. Everybody keeps saying, how do we get into this? How do we know how to teach? Well, it was Ed Foote actually that said this to me. He said, if you can't dance it, then you can't call the stuff. So I would suggest that, like I was in a rural area, we went out, again, we bought Ed Foote tapes, learned how to dance the stuff with one square. Took the same people, put them with another group of people. They helped out, and we worked with them. The group is now grown to quite a size. It's moved to Toronto, and we have a good representation now from our area. But I don't think we can do any of this without knowing how to dance it ourselves.
I've always maintained that any caller should be able to outdance 90% of the people he calls for, no matter what the level. Okay. We're at noon. We're time for lunch. I want to thank you all for your interest. I think we had a good discussion, and I want to thank you for coming. Thanks a lot, Dara, for everything.